pauper collapses in front of Barron Trump. What he does will leave you speechless. Barron Trump stepped out the door, his gaze immediately locking onto an unforeseen scene. A destitute man collapsed before him, marking the beginning of an unpredictable chain of dangerous events. How can a single small decision lead to monumental changes? Dive into a gripping and emotional tale where compassion and resilience triumph over every challenge. Don't forget to like, share, and follow to spread the profound message of this story. Now, let's begin the journey. The streets of Bronx were no strangers to chaos, but today carried an unusual air. The sharp December wind howled through the towering skyscrapers, seeping into every corner and making people shiver. Amidst the rush of the crowd, a man in a tattered coat and worn-out shoes staggered and collapsed. His face was pale, his trembling hands clutching his chest. For a moment, eyes paused on him, only to move along. Phones were raised to capture the scene, but no one stepped forward to help. Nearby, a black limousine pulled to a stop, initially unnoticed. From inside, Barron Trump stepped out, his tall frame striking against the somber sky. Known for his composed demeanor and lavish lifestyle, no one expected him to care, let alone intervene. But he did. Barron's sharp blue eyes scanned the crumpled figure. Something flickered across his face, fear, perhaps, or concern. He knelt beside the man, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Call an ambulance now," Barron ordered his driver, his voice low yet commanding. The man's cracked lips parted as he weakly muttered, "Help me." Barron's expression softened. "I will help you." The crowd murmured, whispers rippling through the bystanders. Why would someone as wealthy as Barron Trump care about a nameless stranger? No one anticipated what would happen next. When the ambulance arrived, paramedics swiftly placed the man on a stretcher. During the commotion, a crumpled piece of paper fell from his pocket. Without hesitation, Barron picked it up. It was a letter, scrawled with shaky handwriting. "To whoever finds this letter, I'm sorry for failing. Please take care of my daughter. Her name is Ava." Barron's heart pounded in his chest. 1,000 questions raced through his mind. Who was this man? Where was Ava? Why did this plea feel so personal, as though it had entangled his own life? It wasn't just sympathy for a stranger. It felt like an invisible force was pulling him closer, compelling him to act, to care. He tucked the note into his pocket, his decision firm. He couldn't ignore this plea. "Follow the ambulance," he instructed his driver. As the limousine merged into traffic, Barron's contemplative gaze fixed on the passing skyline. For years, the world had only seen him as the son of a billionaire, a symbol of opulence. But today, something had shifted within him. This was no longer about wealth or reputation. It was about right and wrong. And he had no idea this decision would alter his life forever. The Mount Sinai hospital reeked of disinfectant and despair. Barron sat stiffly in the waiting room, ignoring the curious glances from nurses and patients. He wasn't here to impress anyone. When the doctor emerged, Barron stood immediately. "How is he?" he asked. "Stable for now, but he's severely malnourished and exhausted," the doctor replied. "Do you know him?" Barron hesitated. "Not exactly, but I found this." He handed over the note. The doctor frowned. "His daughter? He hasn't mentioned her." "Can I see him?" Barron asked. The doctor nodded. Entering the dimly lit room, Barron felt his chest tighten. The man looked so fragile, almost lifeless. Unexpectedly, the man stirred, his eyes fluttering open, a hazy gaze landing on Barron. "Where's Ava?" he rasped. Barron leaned closer, his voice gentle. "Where is she?" "She's alone." Tears streamed down the man's gaunt cheeks. "Promise me, find her." Barron's voice was firm. "I promise." Leaving the Mount Sinai hospital, Barron's heart felt heavy. The man's plea lingered in his mind. Using the information from the man's identification, he traced an address to a rundown apartment in a Bedford-Stuyvesant. The rickety elevator groaned as it carried him to the 4th floor. He knocked on the peeling door, his heart thundering. "Who is it?" A small voice called out. Barron felt his heart tighten. "I'm here to help." The door creaked open slightly, revealing a little girl no older than 6. Her wide eyes were filled with fear, her face smudged with dirt. She clutched a worn, tattered stuffed rabbit, its ear barely hanging by a thread. "Are you Ava?" Barron asked gently. The girl nodded, her lips trembling. "Where's my dad?" Barron knelt to her eye level. "He's at the Mount Sinai Hospital, but he's going to be okay. Can I come in?" Ava hesitated before stepping back to let him in. The apartment was cold and bare, with little furniture to fill the space. Barron swallowed hard. This wasn't just about finding Ava, this was about saving her life. "Do you like pizza?" Barron broke the silence. Ava's eyes lit up momentarily before dimming again. "Dad says we can't afford pizza." "Today's an exception," Barron smiled. "We're having pizza." Dinner took place on the floor, with laughter ringing out as Ava wiped tomato sauce from her chin. For the first time, the frigid apartment seemed warm. After the meal, Barron tucked Ava in with her blanket, promising to stay by her side. As she drifted off to sleep, still clutching her rabbit, Barron made a silent vow. This wouldn't end with one act of kindness. He would fight for Ava, for her father, and for the better life they deserved. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that something larger and darker was still looming. He sat on an old, worn chair, unable to sleep. The creaks of the aging building echoed in the stillness, but his thoughts were louder. A soft vibration on the coffee table broke the silence. His phone. He hesitated before picking it up. "Barron," the voice on the other end began. It was his father. "What's going on? You didn't come home tonight." "I found something important," Barron said quietly, careful not to wake Ava. His father paused. "What is it?" "I'll explain later," Barron replied firmly, ending the call before another question could be asked. He wasn't ready to share the story, not yet. His eyes drifted toward the small room where Ava was sleeping. The crumpled letter, her tear-filled eyes, and the fragile hope etched on her face stayed with him. He had everything while she had nothing. Sitting there, a quiet resolve took hold. This wasn't just something he wanted to do, it was something he had to do. Yet, a nagging feeling lingered. There was something he didn't know, something that could change everything. The next morning, Barron returned to the Mount Sinai Hospital to check on Ava's father. He wanted to tell him that his daughter was safe. But as he entered the room, he froze. A woman in a dark coat stood by the bedside, her back to him. She held a clipboard and was speaking softly to the unconscious man. "Who are you?" Barron's voice was calm but laced with curiosity. The woman turned, her eyes wary as they met his. "I could ask you the same thing," she replied. "I'm a friend," Barron said cautiously. The woman sighed. "I'm a social worker. This man is in terrible condition, and I'm trying to determine if he has any family who can care for his daughter." Barron's stomach clenched. "The girl is fine. She's with me." The woman raised an eyebrow. "With you? And who are you?" Barron hesitated, knowing his name would spark more questions. "Someone who cares." But she didn't look convinced. Caring isn't enough. Ava needs stability. And her father, he may not make it. Barron's fists tightened. He couldn't let Ava fall into the foster care system, but how could he prove he could give her what she needed? Back at the apartment, Barron sat on the floor. With Ava, flipping through an old photo album he found tucked in a corner. The faded pictures were still full of life. A younger version of her father smiling brightly, holding a tiny Ava in his arms. "That's my mom," Ava said softly, pointing to a woman in one of the photos. Barron studied the image. The woman had kind eyes and a warm smile. "Where is she?" he asked gently. Ava's face fell. "She went to heaven," she whispered. Barron's heart ached. This little girl had already endured so much loss. He turned another page and stopped at a different photo. A group of men in uniform stood with Ava's father, their faces somber, almost fearful. "Who are they?" Barron asked. Ava shrugged. "Dad never talked about them." Barron frowned. There was a story here, a hidden truth that Ava's father had kept secret. And somehow, Barron knew it was tied to why this family was struggling so desperately. That evening, as Barron was tidying up the apartment, there was a knock at the door. He opened it cautiously. A tall man in a leather jacket stood on the threshold. "What can I do for you?" Baroness. Tone firm. The man smirked. "I'm looking for Ava's father. He owes me." Barron's stomach tightened. "He's not here." The man stepped closer, his voice dropping to a threatening tone. "When you see him, tell him his time's up. There's nowhere left to run." Barron clenched his fists. "Get out." The man let out a cold laugh before turning and walking away, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. Barron shut the door, his heart pounding. Who was that? And what kind of trouble is Ava's father involved in? He turned to find Ava standing in the hallway, her wide eyes filled with fear. "Who was that?" she asked, her voice trembling. "No one important," Barron lied, forcing a smile. "You don't need to worry." But he was far from calm. The pieces were starting to come together, and the picture they painted was anything but pleasant. Barron knew he couldn't just wait for answers. He had to uncover the danger looming over Ava and her father, and fast. The next day, he returned to the Mount Sinai hospital and confronted the social worker. "I need to know everything about Ava's father." The woman sighed. "There's not much to tell. He's a single dad who's been struggling for years." She paused, hesitating. "But what?" Barron pressed. She leaned in slightly, her voice lowering. "I found some old records. He used to work for a private contractor overseas. Something happened, and he disappeared for a while. When he came back, he was a changed man." Barron's chest tightened. This wasn't just about money or bad luck. This was something bigger, something dangerous. As he left the Mount Sinai hospital, Barron made a decision. He would protect Ava, no matter the cost, even if it meant putting himself in danger. He didn't know where this road would lead, but one thing was clear: there was no turning back. The next day, Barron spent hours searching for information with the help of the family's private investigator. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but he trusted his instincts. Eventually, one name stood out: Mason Cole. It was Ava's father, listed in a classified file tied to a failed rescue mission overseas. Barron's pulse quickened as he read on. Mason had been part of a mission that ended in betrayal, with debts left unpaid. His disappearance hadn't been voluntary. He'd been silenced after exposing corruption within his unit. Barron leaned back in his chair, the weight of the world pressing down on him. This man wasn't just a struggling father. He was a hero who had sacrificed everything. But why was he being hunted now? A knock at the door pulled Barron out of his thoughts. The investigator stepped in, his face pale. "Barron, I just found something else." The man who showed up at the apartment wasn't just a debt collector. "He's connected to people who want Mason dead." Barron's mind raced. Protecting Ava and Mason was no longer just an act of kindness. It was a matter of survival. And he had no idea how far he'd have to go. Fearing for Ava's safety, Barron quickly took action. He instructed his driver to pack her belongings and bring her to a secluded cabin owned by the Trump family, deep in the woods. The drive was silent, with Ava clutching her stuffed rabbit tightly, her eyes staring out the window. "Are we running away?" she asked softly. Barron glanced at her through the rearview mirror. "No, we're staying safe." When they arrived, the cabin was warm and inviting, a stark contrast to Ava's small apartment. She looked around her, eyes wide. "All of this, is it ours?" "Just for now," Barron said gently, smiling. "Until everything is okay." Ava nodded slightly, but the unease lingered in the air. That night, after Ava had fallen asleep, Barron sat by the fireplace, poring over the files on Mason. Each detail painted a picture of a man abandoned by the very system he had served. Barron silently vowed not only to protect Mason and Ava, but also to expose the truth. Yet the howling wind outside the window kept him from shaking the feeling that someone was watching. In the days that followed, Barron's anxiety grew. He began noticing small things: footsteps outside the cabin, shadows moving among the trees. He didn't tell Ava, not wanting to scare her, but he knew he wasn't alone. One night, as Barron sat by the window, his phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number: "We know where you are. Leave before it's too late." Barron's jaw tightened. The people hunting Mason weren't playing games. The next morning, he called the investigator. I need to meet someone who can explain everything, someone who knows the truth. The investigator hesitated. There's someone who used to work with Mason, but he's in hiding too. Reaching him won't be easy. I'll do whatever it takes, Barron replied firmly before heading out. Before leaving, Barron knelt by Ava's bed. She was focused on coloring her stuffed rabbit beside her. I'll be back soon, he promised. Where are you going? She asked softly. To help your dad, he said. Ava nodded quietly, trusting him completely. As Barron stepped into the cold air, he felt the weight of that trust pressing on him. He couldn't let her down. The investigator led Barron to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Inside, a rugged man with wary eyes was waiting. Barron Trump, the man said, his tone skeptical. Didn't expect someone like you to get tangled in this mess. I'm here for Mason, Barron replied. Tell me what happened to him. The man sighed, rubbing his temples. He was the best among us. But he saw something no one was supposed to see, corruption at the highest levels. When he tried to report it, they betrayed him, set him up, and left him to fend for himself. Barron frowned. And now they're trying to kill him? The man nodded gravely. He knows too much. And anyone who helps him, they'll come after them too. A cold weight settled in Barron's chest. He had stepped into something far bigger than he'd imagined. What can I do? He asked. The man handed him a USB drive. Expose them. This has everything Mason risked his life to uncover. But once you do, there's no turning back. Barron slipped the drive into his pocket. For Ava, for Mason, he thought. He was ready. As Barron drove back to the cabin, the weight of the USB drive felt heavier than ever. He had the evidence, but exposing it could put both him and Ava in greater danger. When he arrived, the cabin was eerily quiet. Ava, he called, panic rising. He found her sitting by the window, her eyes fixed on the woods outside. There's a man out there, she whispered. Barron's heart sank. Did he see you? Ava shook her head. I don't think so. Holding her close, Barron felt his mind race. He couldn't wait any longer. The people hunting Mason wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted, or destroyed everything in their path. That night, after Ava was asleep, Barron uploaded the entire contents of the USB drive to a secure server and sent copies to trusted journalists. He knew the revelations would be explosive, exposing a scandal capable of toppling powerful figures. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair, exhausted but resolute. He had made his choice. But as dawn broke, the sight of headlights piercing through the distant woods made his stomach tighten. They had come, and this time, they wouldn't leave empty-handed. The car stopped just outside the trailing. Barron's heart raced as he peeked through the window. 3 men stepped out, their shadows stretching long in the dim morning light. Turning back, he glanced at Ava, still asleep on the small sofa. He couldn't let her witness what was about to happen. He gently shook her awake. Ava, we're going to play a game. Hide and seek, okay? Her sleepy eyes widened. Now. Yes, but this time you have to win. Hide in the secret spot we found in the closet and don't come out until I call you. Ava nodded, clutching her stuffed rabbit tightly as she ran to her hiding place. Barron took a deep breath, steeling himself. When the men reached the door and pounded heavily, the sound echoed through the small cabin. Barron stood tall and opened the door, his posture defiant despite the fear gnawing at him. What do you want? He asked, his voice steady. One of the men smirked. You've been busy, haven't you? Hand over the data, and maybe we'll let you and the girl go. Barron's heart pounded, but his voice remained firm. I don't have it anymore. The man's expression darkened. Wrong answer. The door burst open with a loud crash, and chaos erupted. The men surged forward, but Barron was ready. He grabbed a heavy lamp and swung it hard at one of the intruders, sending him sprawling. Big mistake, kid, another man growled, lunging at him. Barron ducked, adrenaline fueling his movements. He wasn't trained for this, but desperation gave him strength. This wasn't just about him, it was about Ava. One of the men spotted Ava's small backpack on the floor. She's here, he sneered. No, she's not. Barron shouted, tackling him. They crashed into the coffee table, splintering it. "Get off me," the man roared, shoving Barron aside. But Barron refused to give up, grabbing a broken piece of wood and swinging it with all his might, determined to buy Ava more time. Suddenly, blinding headlights flooded the outside, accompanied by the blare of sirens. The men froze. Barron's heart jumped. It was his investigator, accompanied by 2 police officers. "Drop your weapons," one officer shouted, storming in. The men hesitated, then slowly raised their hands. Barron leaned against the wall, gasping for breath. It was over, or so he thought. As the men were handcuffed and led away, Barron checked on Ava. She was still curled up in the closet, clutching her stuffed rabbit tightly. "It's okay now," he whispered, pulling her into his arms. "You're safe." Tears streamed down Ava's face as she clung to him. "I was so scared." Barron held her tightly, tears threatening to spill from his own eyes. "I'll never let anything happen to you." Later that day, the investigator brought grim news. "Mason's condition is worsening. He might not make it." Barron's chest tightened. "No, he has to survive. Ava needs him." The investigator shook his head. "You should prepare for the worst." Barron sat silently, the weight of everything pressing down on him. He had fought so hard to protect Ava, but this was a battle he couldn't win. That night, after Ava had fallen asleep, Barron made a quiet promise to himself. If Mason didn't make it, he would do everything in his power to give Ava a life filled with love and safety. But deep down, he prayed for a miracle. The next morning, the Mount Sinai hospital called. Mason had regained consciousness. Barron hurriedly brought Ava to see him, her small hand clutching his tightly. As they entered the room, Mason's eyes welled with tears. "Ava," he said, his voice weak but filled with love. "Daddy," she cried, running to his side. Barron stayed back, his heart swelling with joy as he watched their reunion. Mason looked at Barron, gratitude shining through his exhaustion. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't have to," Barron replied. "Just focus on getting better." In the weeks that followed, Mason's health steadily improved. Barron visited often, bringing Ava's favorite snacks and reading stories to her when her father was too tired. One day, as they sat together, Mason said, "I've seen what you've done for my daughter. You gave her hope when I couldn't. I'll never forget that." Barron smiled, though his heart ached. He didn't need gratitude. He just wanted Ava to be happy. As he left the Mount Sinai hospital that night, Barron looked up at the starry sky, a sense of peace washing over him. The storm had finally passed. Months later, Mason had fully recovered, and Ava returned to school. Barron stayed in close contact, visiting often and ensuring they never lacked anything. One evening, as the 3 of them sat around a small dinner table, Ava handed Barron a drawing. It depicted him, Mason, and herself holding hands under a bright sun. "You're our hero," she said with a bright smile. Barron's eyes filled with tears. "No, Ava, you're my hero." News of Barron's kindness spread quickly. Newspapers covered the story, but he paid no attention to the spotlight. What mattered to him were the lives he had touched. One small act of compassion had set off a chain of events that changed everything. As he stood to leave, Mason grasped his hand. "You didn't just save us. You reminded me that there's still good in this world." Barron nodded, his heart brimming with gratitude. As he stepped into the cool evening air, he felt lighter than ever. He wasn't just the son of a billionaire. He was someone who had made a difference. The story of Barron Trump is a reminder that, no matter the circumstances, compassion and courage can bring about meaningful change. What do you think of Barron's decision to protect Ava and her father despite the looming dangers? Have you ever had to stand up for what's right, knowing the path wouldn't be easy? Share your story in the comments. Your experiences might inspire others. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel to spread the message of bravery and kindness. Thank you for following and supporting us. Together, let's start small to create a better world. Disclaimer: these stories are fictional, crafted with the assistance of AI, and do not represent any specific individual or organization. We hope they inspire you to appreciate the values of humanity in life. If there are any inaccuracies, we kindly ask for your understanding. Wishing you all the best in life.